Let's cross live now to the Bay Area, where we can speak to Professor of Economics and Politics at St. Mary's College of California, Jack Rasmus. You're most welcome, sir. Washington has proposed lifting sanctions on Iranian oil already at sea. That's an estimated 140 million barrels of crude, which accounts for just over a day of global demand. Considering the decades of sanctions against Iran, it appears a peculiar solution. What was your reaction to that announcement?
Well, my immediate reaction was this is part Besson's statement. He's a Secretary of Treasury. His statement is just the latest in a series of administration statements that are trying to talk down the price of oil, which keeps rising, right? I mean, Trump a week or so ago said, "Oh, the war's over pretty soon," right? And then the price of oil went down a little bit. Then it came back up. Then the Energy Secretary of the U.S. said, "Oh, we're escorting, the U.S. Navy is escorting ships through the Hormuz Strait," which of course was a lie. Price went down, and then they had to take it off their website when it was obviously true. And Besant now says somehow there's 140 million barrels of oil somehow on behind the Hormuz Strait on Iranian ships. Well, my understanding was the Iranians were freely shipping anyway. They were allowing their tankers to go through the Gulf and, sending it to China and wherever. How is the U.S. going to increase the flow by simply eliminating sanctions? And first of all, they're just talking about eliminating sanctions, which means they're just trying to talk it down, right? They're not going to eliminate sanctions. But let's say they do eliminate the sanctions, right? So somehow the U.S. is going to grab 140 million barrels of oil on Iranian ships, or somehow it's going to redirect that oil away from China into other sources. I mean, it's just a total nonsense statement. You can't put much truth into any of these administration statements about how they're going to increase the flow or supply of global oil, because it's all about talking down the price of oil, which now is, $110 a barrel, going up, especially now that, the Israelis attacked the South Pars gas field, and then the Iranians responded elsewhere in Saudi Arabia and UAE and so forth. I mean, they really escalated the whole thing, which is what Israel wants to do. It wants to maintain escalation control, and it wants to keep this thing escalating because basically the whole Israeli strategy is to create devastation in all the states nearby, create a whole series of failed states, and therefore, they can prevail in the whole region and expand. That's their long-term strategy. Trump talks about, 13.5 million barrels the U.S. produces every day. We don't need the oil. Well, why the hell are we there? We don't need the oil. Well, they're there because, Israel runs the U.S. government.
Just on that latter point, Donald Trump's earlier demands to get allies involved in unblocking the Hormuz Strait, it hasn't really come to anything at all. Now he says America doesn't much care about the waterway anyway. Is all this, Dr. Rasmus, a victory of sorts for Tehran?
Well, right now, obviously, the longer the war goes on, the longer, more likely Tehran's going to prevail, because you're going to see an acceleration of the global economic intensity and problems here. I just produced an article on some of the economic consequences of the war in Iran, and it's across the board. There's multiple, at least a dozen serious economic consequences that now you're going to see even more clearly begin to develop. And the longer the war goes, strategically, Tehran's in control. Trump, I believe, made a big mistake here. He thought this would be Venezuela 2.0. He thought that some pressure, the government would collapse, and he'd knock a few people off, and the government would collapse, and then the U.S. can dictate. But Iran is not Venezuela. Venezuela didn't put up a fight. Venezuela, I believe, cut a deal with Trump, and they allowed the special forces of the U.S. and helicopters flying across Caracas and, grabbing the president and taking him out of Caracas, and I think that gave him more confidence that he could pull the same thing off in Venezuela, which just shows how ignorant he is of the basics, the fundamentals of that whole war and that situation with Iran. And then you got the Israelis and the neocons talking in his ear. Oh, we can do it. We can do it. And of course, he jumps to do it. And now he's in a, as I say in my article, he's got a wildcat in a bag, and he doesn't know whether to unload the bag or run. And I think, long term, the longer it goes, the clearer it's going to be that Tehran's going to prevail here, which means the U.S. will declare victory. We'll say, oh, we knocked off their uranium and we destroyed all their missiles as the missiles keep falling on Israel. And we're leaving. We won. Victory. I see that's what the outcome's going to be.
Well, I think some of my opening remarks there, we played it before the interview, sir, with Benjamin Netanyahu. He now wants the Gulf states to export their oil through a pipeline crossing Israel. Is that plausible? And perhaps was it in Mr. Netanyahu's thinking all along that we're going to become a key transit hub for energy now, never mind the Strait of Hormuz?
Oh, that's just nonsense talk, I mean, what are you going to build a pipeline? I mean, there's nothing more exposable for destruction than a pipeline. And how long is that going to take to build the pipeline? Is that going to end this war? Is that going to stop the global economy from crashing here 3-4 months from now? That's just talk, He's throwing up an alternative here. And who's going to believe him in the Gulf states? Because the Gulf states clearly know that, the recent destruction after the South Pars oil field of their facilities was because Israel pressed the whole thing and escalated the whole thing. I don't think anyone's going to cooperate with sending their oil through Israel.
Can I mention some big figures as well? 200 billion is what the Pentagon is seeking in terms of additional funds for the Iran war. Will that be approved?
I don't think so. Well, I won't say that. It might be because this is such a controlled Congress right now. But, I have a forthcoming book called The Twilight of American Imperialism. And in that book, I document the full cost of the war and defense to the United States. We are now spending in the United States $2.2 trillion a year on defense. 1.1 trillion, directly in Pentagon and defense, but there are other expenditures, on the CIA and Homeland Security and Veterans Affairs and everything. When you add it up, it's 2.2 trillion. And Trump has asked for 400 billion more just for the Pentagon, and now Hegseth says 200 billion. I mean, that's $2.7 trillion we're going to spend on defense, and we spend $1.1 trillion on interest on the debt, which is largely responsible, because of the defense budget ballooning. It's a fiscal train wreck. It can't go on forever, and I think before Trump's administration is over, we're going to see that we're going to hit a wall here with this fiscal crisis in the U.S. because we can't spend $2.7 trillion. I mean, the total U.S. expenditure is $7 trillion, so we're spending half of it of all our revenue and all our borrowing, and we're borrowing $2 trillion a year, of course, to help pay for it. 200 billion. No, I don't see that occurring, but I could be wrong because this is a strange Congress. It's at least until the November elections, they'll do whatever Trump wants, and of course, what Netanyahu wants.
Well, on that as well, it does appear, sir, to be a division of sorts between what Israel wants and what the U.S. now is seeking from the Iran conflict. And that division, we've had Tulsi Gabbard, Director of National Intelligence, revealing that there are indeed different objectives. Is this the start of a wider rift? Is this the U.S. saying, Israel, go ahead, we'll follow your lead behind the scenes, and the U.S. just wants to get out of there, fearing another forever war, another Vietnam?
No, I think Trump is totally committed with Netanyahu, and I don't see him really looking for a serious way out of this. There are forces in the U.S. now are beginning to, within the government itself, beginning to really
Within MAGA as well, there's a lot of echoes of criticism, isn't there?
Yeah, but there's also a backlash going on. They're going after meaning the Justice Department and other sectors in the media are really going after any of the critics. They're going after Tucker Carlson. They're going after this guy Jack Kent, who spilled the beans from inside what's going on. So I see a real crackdown, legal crackdown on free speech that's going to occur here as the crisis deepens internationally.
Okay. Always fascinating to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us. Dr. Jack Rasmus, Professor of Economics and Politics at St. Mary's College of California.